Welcome to Wordbirds, where you'll hear content conversations directly from the flock. Join Christopher Willis in conversation with content experts and thought leaders as they chat about how to make the most out of your words in business. Here's your host, Chris.
Hello and welcome to Wordbirds, a birds of a feather conversation between people that care about words. Today on the show, I have Megan Nixon. Megan is Senior Content Strategy Manager at Wayfair. She focuses on content governance. Now, this is a topic that's very close to me. I care a lot about content governance, and Megan and I have been emailing back and forth for about a year and a half. We have never spoken in person. Today, you're going to hear the first conversation we've ever had. I'm excited. Let's sit back and get some insight from the flock. Megan, nice to have you on the show.
Excited to be here, Chris.
Fantastic. I think a great way to get started in this conversation is to understand a little bit of the backstory of Megan Nixon. How did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so I actually started my career in sales and realized sending the emails was my favorite part. Definitely not the cold calling. I was dreadful at that. And the content marketing team at Upserve, where I started, brought me on board. And since then, I've just been in the content marketing world. Had the opportunity to work at Cloud Health before it was acquired by VMware, and then moved over to Wayfair. And it's just been a very content driven career so far, and I love it.
Fantastic. I think it's interesting that you say the thing about selling was the emails. I think that, for me, I feel the same way. I love prospecting, but I like email prospecting. I feel like I can get a lot more across in an email than if I catch you on the phone. I also am not a huge fan of having people hang up on me.
I had a lot of that, some cursing before, just to add a little spice. And people are much less likely to curse you out over email. Some still do, but it's a lot more enjoyable.
Interesting that people would get that worked up about a B2B communication, but I guess they do. Kind of fun. So looking into sort of how you describe what you do, you describe yourself as a data-driven content creation person. What does that mean? How do you define that?
Yeah, so I see content as a really nice meeting point between data and creativity. So you're not just producing for the sake of producing something, you have a goal of what people need to know and being able to be the one to offer them that self-service information so they can make a decision that's best for them or their company. So to have data drive your content, you need to understand what questions your customers are asking or your potential customers even further up in the funnel. Where are they scrolling on a page? Where are they stopping? Is that because they have their answer? Is that because they realize it's the wrong space? What are they clicking on? Is it bringing them to the right space? And just having all that information of how they interact with your content. Are they opening up the emails? Are they scrolling down? Are they continuing on? And providing more of what is performing, not because it feels good or it's your favorite thing to produce, but because you're actually completing the customer journey. And no customer journey now with the internet is linear. It's very, very cyclical, and it goes from top of funnel, middle, back to top, maybe to the bottom. Then they find another competitor, it's back to the top. So making sure that you're not building it out in a way where they need to hit each part once, and making sure that you're providing the correct information at each of those parts, no matter how many times they revisit.
So, essentially creating for impact, not just creating words for words' sake, but looking at what the business purpose is of the content, and then developing a process, a strategy to be able to reach the expected impact, essentially.
Yep. The business impact, but also the customer impact. I think we get really wrapped up in companies about, we want to sell X amount, we want to increase revenue by X amount this half. And you kind of like, okay, well, the company cares about this. It's what do your customers care about and how can the company help? And distilling it back to that customer or user focus, that kind of takes it one step away from the business impact, but it has a bigger impact on the business than if you're just driving based on company goals and not customer goals.
So how do you measure that? How do you know it's working?
At the end of the day, it's working because we have a lot of organic driven people within our system,
Mhm.
or closing customers that came to us organically. I think being able to provide people information that they find on their own is a lot more powerful than just pushing it through and having someone who's already interested. And that's the power of content because it's a very self-service field. They're able to digest it on their own terms, they're able to find it on their own terms and sign up for more on their own terms, especially with GDPR. So that's usually where I see the success is how they've come to us and how many pieces of content they've hit along the way, and if they feel comfortable at the end of the day signing on for the product. And a lot of that comes from also talking to the sales team.
I love what you're saying. That there's a measure at the end of it, and the measure is organic leads entering the process. Essentially, the way that you value the work that you do in content marketing is revenue.
Yep.
Are you creating are you creating revenue through the content that you are building? That's exactly where you should be. It's amazing. The reason that we're talking today is that Megan and I have been communicating over LinkedIn for the better part of a year and a half about content governance. And essentially, the communication has been scheduling a conversation that we have not had yet about content governance. Megan's very tied to content governance inside Wayfair. I am very interested in talking about content governance in general all the time. And we thought if we're going to have a conversation, well, why not record it, put it on the internet? So here we are. Um, from a content governance standpoint, what do you mean when you say content governance?
Yeah, so content governance to me, and I've read a million things across the internet because as a content person, you're not doing your due diligence unless you're reading way too much. They start to get a little confused. But content governance, in my terms, is owning your content, having the ability to edit it, update it, archive it, um, publish, unpublish, eventually um, change it for the times, all within a really structured set of guardrails. So the guardrails change based on the piece of content, but the idea is that all of those actions that you could take have to be incredibly limited. So you're not having multiple different voices and tones, stories, or anything else out there without a very clear guidance.
I mean, it's such a big word, the concept of governance. I mean, it's transparency in process, it's collaboration. There's some automation in there. It's about the language that you use, the way that you use that language, and I think that everybody, every company, in my experience, has a sense of what you're talking about. I think a lot of companies practice a passive approach towards governance, like, well, we like things, we know consistency matters, and we know that there's a right way to do things. And the assumption is that getting things right early in the process will save us time and money. And the right content created the right way will generate more results for us. And we know that. And that's the end of that story. Like, we're going to aspirationally build content that we hope meets some of those objectives. Um, how do you start with building a governance model in your business? Like, what do you build? Who's involved in that process? How do you know you're right?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think a lot of companies build out the guidelines. This is our style guide. This is how you should be writing. This is the words that we do use or that we don't use. And this is how we publish. And then anticipate people actually using that. And there's guidelines, but there's no guardrails. So it's always that next step that I see companies not investing in because they're like, well, we have a style guide. Well, do you have something in place, whether it's a tool or a process, to make sure people are following that style guide? Or is it kind of in hoping for the best with giving them that? And as companies scale and get larger, you run into that a lot more. If there's like two copywriters for the company, they live and breathe the style guide, maybe they made it, you're not going to ever see the need for building out a governance program. But at the larger companies, you're running into multiple different people writing for multiple different end users with slight tweaks, and they completely understand their space more. So I believe content governance really distills down to three things. You have the people, the process, and the tools. And to have those three aspects really fully set up is where you start. So you want to make sure that every single person that interacts with text is on board. It's going to be way too many stakeholders in one room. It's overwhelming. I like to divide it into the people that do it and the people that let them do it. So you have the leadership team where you have that conversation about content governance, explain to them, your team's going to need to shift either their tooling or workflow. There needs to be more stopgaps put in between. They're going to need to approach a completely new team or or check out this checklist. Like you're gonna have to ask them to give you some of their team's time, and then talking to the people that are actually executing on content, you're gonna ask them to completely change their end part of the process. They're like, well, I know the style guide, I've been writing for years. And it's like that's completely fine. We just want to make sure as we evolve our language and tone that you're able to keep up to date. Because that's the big thing with content governance is it's about keeping your text up to date. Whether a stat changes, the industry changes, your voice and tone changes, the way that you're displaying your content changes, that's the first thing on a company website or blog or anything that kind of falls through the crack is the older content. So being able to have that process that keeps them up to date. And it's the biggest thing is the stakeholders and not just getting them to agree that it's important. Like you said, everyone will tell you content governance is important. Very rarely will they right off the bat give you the time to execute on content governance. It's
Yeah, I
exhausting.
mean, I think, a couple of things of what you just said. I mean, one is, so we find the people to create the content and we bring them into, or their management into this process. But what I see in the world is that we're still, most businesses are not super excited about legislating the use of governance guidelines. It's fine for this writers group. I've got this group here that creates this piece of content, this group of content, and I can tell them what to do. But I also have agencies that are creating content for me. I also have contractors. I have other people, employees that just come to work that create content as a byproduct of their workday, and they're not going to use our process. And now you end up with governed, like measurably, I'm going to call it good content aligned with your model, and then a category, a package of content that at best is unknown. And that from my visibility is a big problem for businesses, because I've gone through the process of creating a governance model. I have some people that are using it, that are creating phenomenal content, and I have some people that don't even know it exists, that are feeding content into the same repository. Do you see that in your business? Is that a problem that you've already addressed?
That's a situation that we're currently addressing because we do see it as well. You have the content creators who that's their whole job. They're focused on producing content and they're incredibly skilled within that work. And then there's people like you said who's kind of a product of their job ends up being content, but they could be engineers, they could be product owners, they could be something where that's not exactly where they put their energy and effort into, and those aren't conversations they're involved in. And so that's when I really lean in the tool. So, like you said, a content repository. If people are putting text into a tool, there needs to be a content owner. And that's something that's an incredibly difficult conversation I'm finding out because people want to produce their content and they understand the value of it, but they don't want to own it. Like they really don't want to be responsible for going through the checklist, checking in on it every 6 months, but that's just the responsibility of producing content. So it's either the person that's creating it has to have a conversation with someone who is a content strategist and learn what owning their content is like and being on the hook, their name attached, or it's handed off to someone on the team who is already the content strategist or the content owner. And there's a very clear handoff where that person who produced the content gives up responsibility. So that way they can't go into the system and change things as they think about them or update them. They have to directly communicate with the person who now owns it. And that is incredibly taxing on content strategists. That's adding more than they're already producing and working on to now have responsibility for this subject matter experts text that they necessarily didn't produce or it's a thought piece that they don't really own. But it's the only way to make sure because once something's in your content repository, it's either owned or it's gone because someone might forget it's there if they don't own it. Like you can't keep track of thousands of pieces unless it's divided across people, and that's really the big challenge is making sure you cut it off before it gets to that point.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think in my conversations with content organizations in some of the bigger companies out there in the world, when you talk about the content as an asset in the business, and look at what they own, how much of it there is in their business, and then how much they maintain, the the maintenance number is generally, when they estimate, 10%. So they're maintaining, uplifting 10% of the content that lives in their content repositories. So cool, cool, cool. We've got 10% of your content that's usable. Problem is that 100% of it is available to be used. So that means 90% of your content is potentially bad, dangerous, risk filled, out of compliance, regulatory, like against regulations, any number of things that could live in the 90% because you don't, like you say, have an owner for that content. Nobody's thinking about the fact that a salesperson could reach in and grab it and send it to a customer, or it could get pulled up back onto the website, or worse, it's already on the website, probably is already on the website.
Probably on the website. Google probably indexed it really high for some reason. And if people search up your company, that's what's most likely going to come up.
Absolutely, every single time, and and then you see it, and you're like, I wish that wouldn't come up so much, but again, because nobody owns it in most cases, who changes it until there's a major rev of your website and you shift. So, I mean, through this type of a model, I mean, you're dealing with, you said that all of these different people inside the business and a governance model that is probably hierarchical. So there's rules at the top that fold down into different silos, into different groups, into different approaches of content. How do you, there's a lot to organize. How do you make this stick? How do you get people to follow this on a day-to-day basis so that from the day that you start going forward, you are creating what you would define as usable, valuable content?
So ideally, a company starts and has a content governance plan as they first make their first piece of content or their website, and that's never it. It's usually after there's a million different things on the company, there's all this ungoverned content. And so, what really needs to happen, and what you get the most pushback, or at least I have from stakeholders, is a content audit. It's not sexy, it's not fun, it's time consuming. And unless you're really in the content world, it's hard to understand the value. But most companies have some sort of structure. Companies I've been at have been incredibly matrix. So there's someone that owns a product, there's someone that owns a certain web page, and it's very clear ownership of once it's live. But it's is the person who owns the product that's on the homepage the actual owner of the text, or is it the homepage owner that owns the text because it lives on the homepage? So the first step is breaking down and having these teams go, okay, if you're, a registry team, do an audit of all the registry content across all the websites that it touches. And if you're a homepage owner, do an audit of all the text on every single homepage or landing page or anything else within your scope. And that usually is the most time consuming piece of content governance, or actually putting a plan in place, because you find a lot more content than you're banking on. You know the basic stuff in your head if you're working within it, but saying, okay, is this translated somewhere? Who translated that? Who's upkeeping the translation? What's the actual source content? Is it for different brands? Do we have it like slightly different, even if it's in English for different geos? And really start picking and unraveling that, because translation, localization, branding, different visualizations of the same text all fall under content ownership and content management. And it may be the same text worded slightly different, there might be different owners. So once you have that audit, it's then identifying every single piece connected to a person, and even more than a person, because unfortunately we've seen a lot of brain drain across all of the tech industry within the past few years with COVID, where people leave companies. There's a great resignation across all of the tech spaces. People are joining new companies. You can't say, okay, you know, Nix owns this piece of content. Because if I went somewhere, who's Nix? Why do they own it? Then you say, okay, the senior whatever of this place owns this content. And that way it kind of goes past the people and more into part of the role and eventually the job description.
Yep.
And that's what you really want. You want it to be part of people's day-to-day job to maintain their content, even if they're not a content strategist.
Wow. And I mean, a word to scale, if you're listening to this and you don't really understand the volume of content that Megan deals with, I mean, I would guess hundreds of thousands of category landing pages,
Yep.
and millions of pages of product across your website. Like, that some of the content you own, but to your point, some of the content's coming directly from the manufacturer, the vendor that's selling through your site. Um, you've got a puzzle that you deal with every day. Like you're never going to not be busy.
I love it. I love puzzles, but it's a puzzle that doesn't have a correct answer. You have multiple answers, and one might be the right answer for now, but it might not be the right answer for 10 years from now. And finding that middle ground of a solution is what I actually spend a lot of my time doing. Because you don't want to solve something and then revisit in 6 months. That's
Right.
not a good use of anyone's time. I don't know what it is, but time goes by wicked fast. So you're like, okay, 6 months, I'm just going to restart it once I finish. But you also don't want to build something that's too large that's not actionable for now. So finding something that could grow but won't need to be revisited too often is the real trick of content governance, because you want it to be disciplined and detailed enough for the day-to-day use cases, but you don't want to have to shift and roll out a completely new process to all these people you just got on board if something changes, if you add a new language or a new way that you're delivering your content. So it's incredibly tricky, but that's probably my favorite part of my job.
I mean, and it's a great place to be when you actually can enjoy um, the scope of this puzzle that you have in front of you. I mean, I think thinking about my own process here when I got to my current company, like many people in a CMO role, I wanted to put my stamp on the way that we create content, and I built out our strategic guidelines, how we want to communicate, our tone of voice, our clarity, consistency, and character, and I'll say I modeled it after a combination of me and my voice and our founder, the product inventor, Andrew Bredenkamp. And so it's this composite of sort of science and me, the liberal arts space type person. And it was quirky and fun, and it worked. We rolled it out in all of our new content to our sales and marketing audience, and it killed it. They liked what they heard, the way that they heard it. We were creating engagement, and being me, I said, "Cool. Who else is creating content here? Because I want everybody to use this. This is amazing." And this is the learning part. Is they said, "Oh, support creates a lot of content. They create a lot of support tickets. Fantastic, folks. Use our implementation of our product. Provides all the guidelines. Boom, go." And off they went and leveraged my guidelines. You know who doesn't think I'm cute and funny? Support customers. They don't think so at all. They actually want consistency, clarity. They want managed terminology. They want a simple answer to a problem that they have so they can quickly fix and move forward. And so the idea of sort of company wide customer touchpoint experience management didn't work for us because one voice isn't enough. It works in one place, doesn't work in the other. And that's where I talk about the hierarchical model. At the top of it, we all spell the name of the company right. Like that's the first rule. And if you can roll down from there, there's ways to handle sales and marketing communications. They inherit from that top level. There's ways to handle support that inherit from that top level, but we're all slightly different. And that was an interesting thing to learn. I mean, the crazy part of it was the immediate reaction from our support team. You're doing it wrong and you're killing us. Everybody's mad. And I think they're mad at you. Oh, neat. Cool. All right.
Love to hear that. Motivational, encouraging.
Time to get better. I mean, staying on the crazy theme, you've been doing this for a while now at a very big company. What's the craziest thing you've seen in terms of creating, following the governance model that you've built?
I guess the craziest thing I've seen, and I've seen it at a few companies I've been at, is when you join and you start this governance model, you might have a few things that fall through the crack. Maybe a few people have more access than they should. And just waking up and going on to the website when you start your workday and seeing that someone had access to upload something to the website and they spelled something wrong or it wasn't supposed to go live. I've seen that more times than I want to admit. And it's never them. It lands on me. Like at the end of the day, like I'm the gatekeeper, unfortunately. So I'm getting blown up over Slack and email and how did this go live? Oh, when someone spelled the name of the company wrong on the website. And it's things like that where you're like, I thought I restricted access to everyone, like very specifically, and did all my trainings, but I must have missed like someone that had access. And no matter how many times I start over building governance at companies for content, that's always happened. It's always been something where it's like, how did you get in there? And then you have to talk to them and be like, why did you do that? Like, why are you in there? And they're like, oh, yeah, I mean, it's what I usually do. It's just the first time you caught it. And you're like, I don't know, that kind of thing keeps me up at night. Like, that's where I'm like, go do better next time. And the next time, something always falls through the cracks. And that's where, like, at this point, you have to realize governance is a lot of failing. Like, building out a content governance plan, you have to fail to understand, like you said, with your voice and tone. If you just put things out and they're like a quote unquote success all the time, then no one's actually really using it. Because I could not predict how support's going to interact with people. I can't predict how engineering's going to get on the website. Like, you're a human, you're not a robot, thank goodness. Like, you're going to run into situations, and that's how you build the best governance plan is by failing and having mistakes and then readjusting to make it an actual livable system. Because if you're not rubbing people the wrong way or changing things up as you're building out these new processes, you're either not changing enough or no one's actually following it. And both of those are a waste of your time.
I mean, I love what you're saying because I feel like we've created a world where, if you start with strategy to drive your guidelines, that strategy is derived internally for the most part. It's people like you and I that have this as a job, and we should know how to communicate. We should know the clarity, consistency, and character of the content that we roll out. And so we build this model. And at the end of our part of this, we have something that is able to be measured as good, as quality content. Cool. We put it out in the world. That's where things get interesting, though, because we did this internally, we created this, and the world is going to be the judge of how this content actually resonates, the relationship that we build. And I'm so interested just in my business, in life in general, of moving from strategy alignment to audience alignment and letting the audience inform. And the way that you're saying it is slightly different, but you're saying the same thing. You're talking about failing. I have a great piece of content, I put it out in the world, it doesn't perform. What do I do now? Do I say that, everything is broken, or do I take away from it? Why is it not performing? What can I learn from the lack of performance to help inform the process and build that back into the strategy, so that I'm constantly getting closer and closer to creating the content that engages the audience the way the audience wants to be engaged? Because at the end of the day, our primary touch point right now with our audiences is through the written word. And so I got to get this right if I want to be competitive at a global scale, right?
Yeah. And I would never say like a piece of content that you roll out that has a purpose within the company, not getting the impressions or the interactions with the end users as a failure. And that's something that's really hard to go from a content position and bring that to upper leadership or bring that back to your team and say, okay, no one actually cared about this, whether it's like a landing page, an email, or a blog. Usually it's blogs. Those are a lot easier to roll out and test new things. Personally, if I have something that I'm not sure is going to be a hit, usually put it as a blog because you could send that out multiple different ways. People could find it organically. You have a lot more grace in that space. But if you think it's so important, and there's a reason why you think it's so important in the company to put company time and energy into producing, then it's a message that people need to hear. It might not be something that's wrong with the message, it might be its format. Like maybe it should have been a video. Maybe it should have been a webinar. Could have been an ebook, needs to be sent out an email, actually needs to be handed from sales directly to the customer. And it's if you have the right content strategy, and by right, I mean you're already listening to what your customers are interested in by what they're searching and where they're landing on your website and how they're asking questions as customers to customer support and asking questions to sales as prospects, the real issue, not issue, but the real challenge with content is the delivery. Because they might not be asking that, but they might need to have that information to make a decision on if they're going to buy your service. Or they might not be asking that until they have your service. And they're like, oh, I actually have now more time because you saved me time to focus on the granularities of like this work. And I never once considered this. And now I have the ability to. So it's unwrapping that. And if something is a bust, you think it's going to be the hottest new thing in your space and you write an article about it and no one cares, that does happen too. But that shouldn't happen too much. And that only happens if you're thinking about yourself and not about your customer. And if you're only thinking about yourself and what you think would be nice to write about, what you think would be great for your portfolio, then you're in the wrong industry. I've never once been in a field where I was born and wanted to do it. I actually wanted to be an Egyptologist when I grew up. I'm not writing about hieroglyphics. I'm not out here doing that. So like you have to really focus on who you're selling to. It all goes
What are
back
your
to Sam.
dreams though? Go to Egypt. Have you been to Egypt?
No, it's on my bucket list.
Okay.
I really want to go.
Well, we can travel again. It's time. How, I mean, just to bring us into the finish line here, I'd love to understand sort of some guidance to people that want to implement this in their business, just very high level. How would somebody in the content space even start with content governance?
I'm always, always, always going to say a content audit. You can't figure out what your governance plan will be unless you figure out what your content is. And unless you have a content audit or like a very clearly implemented content management system where you could easily audit your work, you have no baseline. And then once you have that audit, the next big step is making sure that you're bringing the stakeholders into the conversation. You could have all these processes and tools, and if you don't have actual people buying into it, then it's not going to get the time of day on the roadmaps. It's not going to be able to be blended into current systems. It's not going to be able to be something that actually has an impact. Governance can't be created in a back room. It has to be the front and center of everyone's mind as they're interacting with however we communicate with customers or internal employees. And then the last thing is making sure that you have the tooling. If you have multiple different writers across the company, you'll need a certain type of tool. If you only have 3, you'll need a different type of tech stack. So making sure that you're giving the people who are going to do the work the right tooling, they have the stakeholder buy-in, and then they're able to actually know what text they're working with and the processes to build out of that. That's really where you start, is just understanding those 3 pillars and then going from there. And it's different. Once you get those done, it's different for every single company on where you're going to spend your time and your energy and your money.
If any of our listeners wanted to continue this conversation with you, where would they find you?
LinkedIn. You can look me up, Megan Nixon. I really like my profile picture on there. So I think it looks kind of like how I do now, a little bit blonder, but it works.
Fantastic. Megan, thank you for being on the show. This was amazing. I think it was super actionable. I think this is going to be really exciting for people. And I would have to imagine that we're going to be back. There's so much more to talk about. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. This was a blast.
Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to join us next time for more insights from people who love words. This podcast was brought to you by Acrolinks. Continue honing your enterprise content by checking out other episodes at acrolinks.com/wordbirds. If you have questions or comments, feel free to get in touch with Chris and his team by sending a message to word.birds@acrolinks.com. That's all for now. See you next time.